Good morning again, family, and welcome back to our study of the resurrection. And as we started last week, we're covering now the final phase of our study, which is the gospel accounts of Jesus' resurrection. And as I mentioned last week, these are some of the oddest stories that you'll ever find in the Bible. If you look at the three synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, um, they seem to set out to see just how different from one another that they could be in their writing of these amazing events. In fact, even a simple comparison of the words that are used in the text by the different gospel writers reveals that there are very few words in common between their accounts. And the other amazing thing is that unlike you frequently encounter, for example, in Matthew, the resurrection stories told in the gospel accounts are told with little to no embroidery from biblical tradition. In other words, there's no real citation of other scriptures about the events of the resurrection. And that's all the more remarkable in view of Paul's statement in 1 Corinthians 15, chapter 15, verse 4, where he said Jesus was raised again according to the scriptures. What we really find in the gospel accounts is a sense of open-ended commission for Christians within this present world. In other words, Jesus has been risen from the grave, and therefore you have work to do ahead of you. And this distinguishes the resurrection narratives from virtually every other mention of the resurrection that's made in Paul and the rest of the New Testament epistles, other than briefly in Acts. When Paul talks about Jesus' resurrection, he connects it almost always with the resurrection of us as Christians. And the same is true of Peter. But the resurrection accounts in the Gospels are basically about the vindication of Jesus, the validation of his messianic claim, and very importantly, about the commission given to his followers to act as his heralds in this present world, announcing to it the new and surprising but rightful Lord that he has become. And it gives us our marching orders. Let's roll, so to speak, about what we're to do in this world as a result of Jesus' resurrection. Another thing that you find curious in the resurrection accounts is the prominent presence of women. As we mentioned last week, women in the ancient world were not viewed as reliable legal witnesses. And the gospel writers would have hardly been ignorant of this fact. And if they could have invented their stories by using reliable male witnesses as being first at the tomb and observing all the events there, they certainly would have elected to do so. But this basically lends credibility to their accounts because they told it like it happened. We covered some similarities that you see in the gospel accounts last week between the different writers. All four of them agreed that the events took place early in the morning on the first day of the week, 3 days after Jesus' crucifixion, after the manner of Jewish counting of days. And all four writers agreed that Mary Magdalene was at the tomb. Matthew, Mark, and Luke agree that another woman was there too, and Mark and Luke add others as well. All four of the writers agree that the stone that blocked the entrance to the tomb was viewed as an apparent problem by the women as they approached the tomb, but that problem was solved without them having to do anything at all. All four writers agree that there was an unusual stranger, an angel or the near equivalent, and a young man that met and spoke with the women. And Matthew and John agree that Mary Magdalene then met Jesus. Matthew has the other Mary there too, shortly after they visited the tomb. And all the writers except Mark agree that Mary and other women, if they're mentioned, go off to tell the male disciples. And Luke and John agree that Peter and another disciple then go to the tomb to see for themselves whether these things were true. If you look at the resurrection stories as a whole, they answer the question of why did early Christianity begin and why did it take the shape that it did? The answer is because early Christians believed devoutly that something had happened to Jesus after his death that was wholly remarkable, unanticipated, and transforming, not only in Jesus' life, but in their own lives as well. There's really no other way to account for the enthusiasm and the dedication of the apostles as they went about their ministry and for the explosive growth in the early church. Without the resurrection, Christianity would have been just a brief phase in history. It would have died a mourning shortly after Jesus' death. But because of the resurrection, we are here today. We have the same hope as they did for the future, and we have the most powerful of messages to deliver to a lost world. Then last week, we started our study of the actual text by looking at Mark's gospel. And Mark's gospel is best understood as an apocalypse, one that's designed to unveil the truth about who Jesus is through a series of revelation type moments. Mark's gospel has a very stark and simple structure to it. And it has an emphasis on the miracles of Jesus as proof of his validity as the Messiah and in particular, the Lord. Mark's gospel was particularly addressed to a Roman audience who largely thought that Caesar was the Lord. But Mark's gospel always points ahead to Jesus' death and resurrection as the climax of his ministry and the vindication of his lordship. Mark's account of the resurrection is told completely from the perspective of the women. The emphasis throughout is on the unexpectedness, both of the event as a whole and of the different segments of the event. The discovery of the empty tomb by the women is presented as a puzzle that's in search of a solution. It's not as if someone already believed in Jesus' resurrection. They now find an empty tomb just to confirm that belief. Instead, what happens is they find an empty tomb, and then they're offered a rather startling and totally unexpected explanation for it, that Jesus indeed has been raised, and that's why the tomb is empty. It's interesting that Jesus' resurrection was not proclaimed publicly until the day of Pentecost, which was 50 days after the Passover weekend when he was crucified. And one might ask, well, why didn't anyone hear about this remarkable event any sooner than that? And I think Mark provides us the answer in chapter 16, verse 8. He said, the women said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. They were afraid because empty tombs and angels would be enough to frighten the daylights out of anyone. And also afraid because they had gone to the tomb in order to anoint the body of someone who was viewed as a rebel by the Roman government and had been crucified as a result of it. And they probably would have preferred that this was not widely known. As we concluded last week, that may in fact be the only time in history that women have kept quiet after seeing and hearing such incredible things. But women certainly were given the honorable position of being the first witnesses to Jesus' resurrection. So today we're going to move into the Gospel of Matthew. And Matthew's account of the resurrection has two stories, and each of them in two parts, which mark him out differently from other gospel accounts. He first describes a pair of earthquakes and a guard of soldiers who are bribed to tell false tales. But in the middle of all this, we also have a story of finding the empty tomb, quite analogous to Mark's account, but with significant differences. Matthew's narrative then concludes with a final commissioning of the disciples on a mountain in Galilee. So let's begin our reading of Matthew's account at the instant of Jesus' death, as recorded in Matthew chapter 27 and verses 50 to 56, where Matthew says, "And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks split. The tombs broke open and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs, and after Jesus' resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many people. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified, and they exclaimed, 'Surely he was the Son of God.' Many women were there, watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee to care for his needs, and among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons." Matthew alone includes this extraordinary story of an earthquake, accompanied by an apparently localized but large-scale rising from the dead. And there are many puzzles in this account, most of which have no certain answers. Recalling that Matthew's gospel was addressed primarily to the Jews, there are Old Testament scriptures that are brought to mind by these curious events. For example, Ezekiel chapter 37 and verses 12 and 13. After Ezekiel saw the vision of the valley of dry bones being resurrected back to life, he recorded in verse 12 of chapter 37, "Therefore prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. O my people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord, when I open your graves and bring you up from them." And we also have Isaiah chapter 26 and verse 19 called to mind, where Isaiah said, "But your dead will live, their bodies will rise. You who dwell in the dust, wake up and shout for joy. Your dew is like the dew of the morning. The earth will give birth to her dead." And finally, we have Daniel chapter 12 and the first part of verse 2, where Daniel says, "Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake." Well, what do these passages tell us about Matthew's intention in including this account of the resurrection of so many holy people? The best answer we can come to is that he is recounting some strange happenings around the time of Jesus' crucifixion and is putting them in the context of biblical allusions to provide some historical sense of them. These happenings include the earthquake causing the veil of the temple to be rent, and the opening of the tombs and the centurion's comment. This story wasn't told to upstage Matthew's own account of Jesus' resurrection, as the picture that he provides of the resurrected Jesus differs dramatically from that of the awakened sleepers. But the accounts have in common a great earthquake, which resulted in the opening of a tomb. Some stories are simply so odd that all you can do is tell them like they happened, without embellishment. And that's what Matthew did. The second half of Matthew's account of the events surrounding the crucifixion proceeds in chapter 27 in verse 57, where it says, "As evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. 'Sir,' they said, 'we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days, I will rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he's been raised from the dead. And this last deception will be worse than the first.' 'Take a guard,' Pilate answered. 'Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how.' So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard." Now, the essence of this story is about events that happened on the Sabbath after Jesus' burial by Joseph the day before. There are 2 things that are of particular note here. First, the chief priests and Pharisees are openly collaborating with the hated Roman governor Pilate. And worse yet, they're doing it on the Sabbath. And if nothing else, this illustrates the desperate measures that the chief priests and the Pharisees were willing to resort to in order to make sure that Jesus' disciples could not steal his body and then claim he was resurrected. What a spectacle here. The very men who were supposed to be the spiritual leaders of the Jews were collaborating with a despised pagan government official, and they were violating every tenet of the Sabbath in doing so, just to make sure that Jesus stayed in the tomb. Matthew's telling indicates that an empty tomb would be recognized from even before Jesus' resurrection as a major potential problem for those who denied he was the Messiah. And so they were determined not to allow the disciples to craft any such story by stealing his body. The story of these guards continues on in Matthew 28, verses 11 through 15, after the appearance of the angel that's recorded in verses 1 through 10. Matthew says, "While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, 'You are to say, his disciples came in the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble.' So the soldiers took the money and they did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day." Now, to begin with, Roman soldiers comprising a guard duty faced a certain death sentence if they fell asleep during their watch. So this story, agreed to by the chief priests and elders and the soldiers of the guard, was highly implausible on its face. But perhaps the most significant thing about this story as a whole is that the Jews knew exactly what it was that they needed to guard. It was Jesus' body. They understood thoroughly what Jesus had forecast in Matthew 16, verse 21, and 17, and verse 23, and chapter 20, and verse 19, regarding his resurrection after 3 days. And although on each of those occasions, Jesus spoke about this in private to his disciples, the word had clearly gotten out to the priests and Pharisees as to his prophecy, perhaps through the traitor Judas. This was reinforced by the testimony in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 61 at Jesus' trial, recalling Jesus' statement about destroying the temple and rebuilding it in 3 days as referring to his body. See also John chapter 2 and verses 20 and 21. So any notion that Jesus' resurrection was anticipated to be some kind of a spiritual resurrection simply cannot be sustained. For then there would have been no need whatsoever for a guard or a stone and a seal, or for stories and counter stories to be circulated what had happened to Jesus' body. And moving on to the second major story that's recorded by Matthew in chapter 28, he introduces his resurrection account with a specific time notice. So let's read in Matthew chapter 28, verses 1 through 10. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid, yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. And suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshiped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, where they will see me." Matthew's account differs from Mark's in that per Matthew, the women go simply to see the tomb, not to bring spices to anoint the body. Matthew doesn't say that they actually went into the tomb, as Mark records, perhaps because Matthew was more mindful of Jewish purity rules about entering a tomb that had a corpse inside of it. The women in Matthew's account are confronted not with a young man, as Mark describes, or with two men in dazzling clothes, as Luke records, but by an angel of the Lord, who provides a rather lengthy statement. And oh, what an appearance by this angel. As Matthew records, his appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. And then, almost comically, the angel says to the women, "Do not be afraid." Just imagine such a spectacle as this. An angel so dazzling as to be like a bolt of lightning. Big, tough Roman soldiers quaking and collapsing like dead men. And then the angel's calm words to the women, "Do not be afraid." Wow. You couldn't write a movie script with more drama than this. Matthew's mode of telling this story lies distinctly within the unique style of his gospel. But it's emphatically the same stark, unlikely, and improbable story recorded from different perspectives as that of all the gospel writers. Matthew felt free to tell the story in his own way, but not free to invent a new story. Finally, we get to the conclusion of Matthew's account in chapter 28, verses 16 through 20, where he says, "Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age.'" Some have suggested that this was the occasion when the 500 plus individuals mentioned by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 6, saw Jesus when they were all together, although Matthew only mentions the 11 being present in this occasion. Like the Great Commission scenes in Luke and John, Matthew concentrates on the instructions that were given to the disciples for their new worldwide mission, which had been in view all along, even though the gospel strategy was restricted in Jesus' lifetime to the lost sheep of Israel, as Matthew recorded in chapter 10, verse 5, and chapter 15, verse 24. But the main emphasis of Matthew's closing paragraph is upon who Jesus is now revealed to be, as he has been granted all authority in heaven and on earth. This is virtually identical to the phraseology of the kingdom clause in the Lord's Prayer, recorded in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6 and verse 10. This is how that prayer is being answered. The Great Commission that Jesus gives to his disciples depends directly upon his possessing all authority in heaven and on earth. The only explanation and justification for this messianic authority and the kingdom fulfillment is that Jesus has been raised from the dead. The strongest mark of authenticity of Matthew's account is in chapter 28, verse 17, where Matthew says, "But some doubted." Now, no one that was crafting a fictional story of Jesus' resurrection and his messianic authority, some 30 to 40 years after Jesus' earthly life, would have included such a line as this, "But some doubted." And also, we note here that, as in the other gospel accounts, there's something different about the resurrected Jesus, which enabled him to do unusual things, but which his disciples couldn't put their finger on at the time. Jesus comes and goes. He appears and disappears. And he is doubted at the very end by some of his close associates. Unlike John, and particularly unlike Luke, Matthew leaves us with somewhat of a mystery regarding the nature of Jesus' resurrected body. Perhaps Matthew was one of those doubters when Jesus first made this appearance. Who knows? Lastly, let's note that baptism is now the mode of entry into the family of God. And as Paul described even more explicitly in Romans chapter 6, baptism is linked inextricably to what the living God has accomplished in Jesus' resurrection. The age to come has been launched with Jesus' resurrection, and the risen Jesus becomes the human bridge between it and the present age. As Paul wrote to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 2:5, some 30 years after Jesus ascended back to heaven, there is one God and one mediator between God and man, the man, Christ Jesus. So eternity has begun, and it will be brought to completeness when we too are resurrected, incorruptible, and immortal. And God himself will dwell with his people, even as his Son now is with us and always will be. What a marvelous gospel account Matthew gives us. Next week, we'll look at Luke's account of the resurrection, and then finally at John's account. And that will be the conclusion of our study of this great topic. So I invite you all to come back to study with us Luke's account next week. Hope everybody is staying safe and healthy, and we're delighted that we're going to be able to resume meeting together tomorrow, Sunday.